Welcome to our next edition of the Cerini Nonprofit Connection. It's a podcast or webinar that we do in order to try to push information out to the nonprofit sector. And today we have as our guest, or please have as our guest, Rich Isaac, who is the President CEO of Sandler Training at Hauppauge. Welcome, Rich.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks for being here. Before we get started, why don't you talk a little bit about what you do over at Sandler Training and how you help the nonprofit sector?
Great. So Sandler Training is actually a worldwide organization, and we run an office here on Long Island. We specialize in business development, customer service, sales, training, coaching, and consulting. So we work across a very broad range of industries because everyone is trying to sell some product or service. And in the not-for-profit world, of course, it's not exactly selling a product or service. It's getting people to fund your not-for-profit, to provide money, to invite people to boards. So we help them to do those same types of things to become more effective at what I'll characterize broadly as business development.
But when you think of a nonprofit organizations are very, very different. It's not like I've got a product or a service. I'm trying to solicit funds. How does what you're doing from a sales training perspective translate to the nonprofit world?
Yeah, very interesting that when we are asking someone for something, in this case, to give us money as it relates to fundraising, we are still trying to get someone to do something, influence someone to do something that we want them to do. Okay. Not very different from in a sales environment where we have a product or service that we might want to convince them or help them discover that they want it. So what's really interesting about it is that while people see them as very different, as I'm sure we'll talk about, the similarities are very, very striking. And I think that because people are often very passionate about their not-for-profit, they have a tendency to try to convince people to give them money, just as people try to convince you to buy their service or their car or whatever they're selling. And obviously they can both be rather counterproductive. So it's our job to help people become more effective at helping people discover that they want to be involved with. In this case, you're not-for-profit.
Sorry, what are those characteristics that make for an effective salesperson or development person or whatever?
So very interesting question, because the quintessential view of a salesperson, meaning the sort of stereotypical one, is someone who's very aggressive, which I find that when I look at certain markets and industries that we get involved with, not-for-profit being one of them, your type of world of accounting being another one, or lawyers, is they don't see themselves that way. And actually, it's a great strength that for people who are not pushy, because they're non-threatening, to be in the position of asking for help. So what makes a good salesperson in selling a product and service and makes a good fundraiser have a lot of very strong characteristics, very similar characteristics.
Okay, so when we're looking at who within an organization really should be gaining a better understanding of how to be an effective development person. I mean, obviously you have your development office, but who else is out there that nonprofits should be looking at and saying, hey, I need to kind of get them some training too.
Right. So in large organizations, not-for-profits, universities, for example, they have large development offices with people who are professionally trained to do this. In most of the not-for-profits, I think that we're both familiar with, many of them are much smaller. And so the person who's running it is the key development person. They might or might not have a professional developer. So therefore, how do you go beyond that? It's very typically the board. How do we get, even inviting people onto the board, getting them involved is sort of a business development sales function. So anyone who, in our opinion, we would characterize as client-facing or customer-facing, who's out there in the world, has the potential to be more effective. So board members, anyone who actually talks to someone, anyone who answers the telephone in that regard has an opportunity to be helpful.
I think one of the big challenges we see when we're talking to our nonprofit clients is, yes, I think everybody understands that there's a certain level of responsibility of the board to bring in a certain level of funding, give or get type role. But I find that a lot of the executive directors complain that the board isn't really pulling their weight, and a lot of it falls back on the executive director. Why do you think in some instances, some of the board members in some organizations are effective, and other organizations, you've got people who just really aren't effective.
Right. So I think that there's a big assumption that if someone gets invited to your board and is willing to do it, that they know how to generate funds, they know how to ask for donations, and that they're comfortable doing so. And I think that both of those are potentially false premises. So I think people are fortunate when they bring someone on who has the gift, the natural tendencies to be able to do it, and they're so thrilled to have them because they don't need a lot of guidance. So I think people who are in that executive position have to nurturingly and not overly aggressively sort of play, for lack of a better word, sales manager. They have to manage these people to do certain things and potentially help teach them how to do those things. You might think, well, that's a very senior person who runs a company and they're on my board. They should know how. They don't necessarily know how. So I think it's our job to, if we expect something from them, to help them to be able to become more effective at it.
So how do we go about doing that? I mean, you're talking about, in essence, going to your boss and saying to your boss, because I mean, obviously the board is the governing body. Hey, you're not doing an effective job at what you're doing. I need you to be more effective at raising money.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, how do you approach it? And then second of all, we'll get maybe a little deeper into what boards should be doing it and how they can become effective.
So two things about that. One is that as a board member myself of a not-for-profit, a business not-for-profit, in this case, the HIA-LI, Housing Industrial Association. First thing is what is the expectation when someone does come to your board? Is there an expectation that you will be, in fact, bring members in, bring board members in, bring money in? So I think that's a key thing.
So something like having a board contract. It's something we talk about with all of our clients, in that it's really important to have a contract so that everybody understands what the expectations are. So if you lay out those expectations early on, it's not a surprise later.
Right. And I think that, I don't know if you guys think of it this way as well, but I would put the word contract in quotes a little bit, or call it a working agreement, meaning that we understand they're volunteers. And so we can't have the same expectations that we necessarily would of control over them as we would an employee, but understanding, like, is this something you're comfortable with? This is what we plan to ask you to do. Is that something you can potentially commit to? And then the question, both early on and then subsequently, is, do you feel comfortable doing it? Do you expect that there are going to be any challenges doing it? And here's a key one. Would you like our help so that you can become more effective at it? Because I would, from my experience and just as a adventure, I guess, in general as well, that people would say, oh yeah, can you help? I want to help. I mean, I'm on the board because I really am passionate, or I believe in this organization. Can you help me? And I think that they might not ask for help. They might be uncomfortable or embarrassed, or might not even realize they need it. So I think at the executive level, that's part of our job.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes, as you said before, I think it comes down to leadership. So if there's someone who can take on that role of leadership, coaching them, teaching them, role playing with them, so that at the end of the day they feel comfortable with the process, I think that goes a long way.
One of the most uncomfortable things for people, interestingly enough, is role playing. You could pretend I'm asking you for money, let's role play, but like, no, I can't do that. I could go ask somebody actually for money more easily than I can role play, but I think it's just a matter of getting them outside their comfort zone. Do they have a talk track in terms of how they might go about doing that? I think it's one other thing about managing them is, just as in the case of typical sales management, one of the key terms that we use is accountability. Do we have expectations, and are we holding people accountable to doing them? Now, that often sounds very onerous and like micromanagement, but I think that's sort of pushing it too far, as opposed to, our expectation is X. Do we agree with that expectation? Let's track that on a regular basis, the expectation could simply be in the number of asks, if it's not in the amount of money we might bring in, for example.
So is it I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Is it going back to then, in terms of equating it back to the whole sales model? Is it kind of creating like a sales budget or a sales quota for your individuals that you're going to be expecting to go out there into the marketplace?
So I think in the not-for-profit world, to have an expectation at a monetary level is appropriate. but not at the same level that we would in a sales world where literally if someone can't hit their numbers, obviously they can't work there. We really ask people to focus on measuring the activity, the behavior, which you can totally control, and then measure the results. And then, so for example, you can suggest to somebody, so how many times a month, a week, obviously it would depend, would you like to ask people for donations, or have conversations with people, or have a cup of coffee with people that would be related to this? And someone might say, I think I could do that 3 times a month. Okay, let's assume that's 3 times a month. Let's do the math to figure out what we hope will happen from that, and we'll measure whether it's working. Then we can go back and say, did you have your 3 times a month? Yes or no? If not, okay, what could we do to help you with that? Maybe we need to help you get more introductions, for example. Or it could be, yes, I'm having the 3 times a month, but I'm not getting the results. Okay, now we can look at, perhaps it's the way you're asking, and then we can work on that. So by focusing on the behavior, it gives people a sense of control, because they can pick up that phone to call someone to set up an appointment, and they have total control over that. They can't control what's going to happen on the back end, but they can measure it.
So how do you know, I mean, you send out board members out there. I'm assuming that if you're going to send out a board member for the first few, you should go with them as the executive director or development person, so that you can kind of lead the discussion and they can kind of use their influence as a board member? Is that?
Well, I think that would be depending on, as you bring them in, are you as an executive taking the time to figure out how comfortable they are and how efficient and effective they are? We were just talking about a gentleman not far from here who's an attorney who's very well known, and he would say, I don't need your help, I know how to ask for money, right? Versus someone else who, if you ask them, how comfortable do you feel with this? Would you like me to come with you? Just a quick side note on that, which is, what are we asking them to do? For example, as part of the organization I was just mentioning, both co-chair of the membership committee and a board member on, we explain to people who are members of the organization that if you're trying to get referrals for new members, you don't have to do all the work. You can have a conversation with them and then say, can I make a suggestion? Why don't you have a conversation with Terry, who's the new membership person? So we don't necessarily have to do all the work. Similarly, it may be that the executive director says to the board member, get an introduction and invite them in. Get an introduction and introduce them to me if you're more comfortable with that. And I think that the people assume they have to do all the work, and it can be much more of a team effort. So we can take advantage of someone's strengths. For example, the board member might know a lot of people, but might not really be as comfortable as the executive person would be. And getting that person to invite people out for a cup of coffee or lunch once a month would be way more effective in the long run.
Okay.
I think every situation would be different.
You know, one of the things that I see out there is that I think that when board members or individuals who, and I know I'm kind of probably guilty of the same thing, when I go out and I'm trying to solicit funds for an organization that I'm involved in, you know, I'll push information out there, but it tends to be more of a passive sort of function, and maybe not as active. I mean, like I said, I'll use social media or online and just kind of push things out. But it's tough to kind of pick up the phone and just say, hey, I'm involved with this organization, you know, write me a check for $20,000.
Right.
You know, that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. You know, how do you get somebody to the point where, you know, maybe they feel like they're asking someone to do them a favor by contributing to the organization they're involved in, versus, you know, getting them to a point where they feel comfortable so that the person that they're working with or the person they're going to be asking feels like, all right, there's some sort of mutual benefit here.
Yeah. So I hear a couple of different things there. One that relates to, what's my process? Do I pick up the phone? Do I invite somebody out? Do I ask them for money? And one thought is that there's 3 or 4 different things we could probably come up with as behaviors. It's okay for us to focus on the ones that we're more comfortable with. In my world of sales training, I have, you know, Sandler franchisees, friends of mine over the years, who said things like, I'll never pick up the phone. I hate picking up the phone. I built my business through networking and strategic alliances. And others who said, I hate people. I don't want to go to a networking group, but I'll pick up the phone and call a stranger anytime. And so I think to find the thing that we're most comfortable with is one aspect of that. So we don't have to do the thing. We can find several different options and then pick the one that makes sense. The second thing I think that you mentioned is, am I asking them for, you know, for money in terms of, this is a favor to me. Sure. I think that there are some cases where someone loves you so much and they want to do you a favor
No one
that they'll
loves
do
me.
that. That's
Not even
fair.
my family.
Not even you can. I think that that is not a strategy. And this is true regardless of the product, service that you're talking about selling, whatever it might be. And please don't take this the wrong way. I say to people, they don't care about you. They don't even care about your not-for-profit.
No, I believe that.
Right? What do they care about? They care about themselves. They care about their vision. So is it appropriate for you to share your passion so that they see that you're interested? Yes, but to a degree, even to the point of, I'm really passionate about this. I don't know that you will be. More importantly, I'd love to understand how you think about philanthropy, how you think about the potential benefits that you could derive from being involved with an organization like ours. I don't know what you're going to find or whether there is going to be that necessarily that sort of fit, but if there is, great. So I think that, sure, it's necessary at some point for us to talk about our organization, what we do, what we believe in. We have an expression in Sandler, which is, we call it the 70-30 rule, which is when you're a salesperson or a business developer, a fundraiser, you're going to be doing 70% of the talking easily. And people are like, oh, tell me about your not-for-profit, blah, 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 right? We think the 70-30 is fine. It's just reversed.
Yeah.
We need them to be talking about themselves, how they think about these things, us sharing some stories with them of what other people have found as the benefit for them. I think that everyone does live in the world of, to some degree, what's in it for me. They may have a very big heart, and that's something you certainly want to tap into, because they might have the same passion around your not-for-profit as you do. But their view of it and why they will do it will be different from why you would do it. And it's our job to figure out why they would want to do it.
So how do you then get it from asking you for a donation to selling you a service? Because as a nonprofit organization, I have certain value that I could potentially deliver on.
Mm-hmm.
I can, my name might be worth something. It could be that I've got contacts and connections. It could be that, I can offer you a benefit because, if you say you're affiliated with me and you're helping to support me, that could be a benefit. I could provide marketing opportunities and social media opportunities for you as a business owner.
Mm-hmm.
How do I now start to change my way of thinking or change the thought process from, hey, I'm soliciting a contribution to, hey, I'm entering into a collaborative agreement with you to sell you something?
Yeah. So I think that any way that we're going to approach people, it has to be what we characterize as non-threatening. I'm going to come back to your question just from a sort of a side view for a moment, because I think that what's important is, regardless of how we want to position it, is we have a tendency to say, I have this thing, I think you're going to love it, or I have this thing that I think can benefit you. And it's very natural for people to be like, hang on there, big fella, right?
Wait, you're a nonprofit.
That's right. What are
you're just asking me for money.
Exactly. Aren't you? Right. Exactly. So how do we approach people in a way that's really non-threatening? And so here would be my approach, just to use a little of our sort of conversational approach in vernacular. I can imagine saying something like, obviously, when we approach people like you about somehow getting involved with our not-for-profit, sometimes people find it as a fit, sometimes they don't. And by the way, just about everyone says, like, what would it do for me? So if you don't mind my asking you, Bob, how do you think something like this might benefit you? And they might actually come up with answers that you could say, yes, that's one, that's two. So they're convincing themselves they should do it. I think very often they're going to be like, I don't know what you mean. How could it possibly benefit me to get involved with a not-for-profit? And then our suggested best approach to that would be not to tell them what it can do for them, but to tell them what it can do, what it has done for them. Right? In other words, it can do this for you and it can do this for you. We call it third-party approach, which is, well, let me share with you what one of our partners has found how it has benefited them. Then we can talk about, they felt it was a partnership. They felt it gave them exposure. They felt that it was a marketing tool for them. They felt that ultimately they got their people involved, which created more of a team spirit. They, these are third-party stories, as we call them, examples. And then we come back to Bob and say, now, I don't know if any of those will relate to you. And so our goal is to not be the equivalent of saying, this is what you should do because it's going to benefit you. Because even if it's true, it has a tendency to make people a little uncomfortable.
So you're trying to find things that you can give in terms of examples that might resonate with them so that they start to see, hey, wait, I could be just like them.
Exactly right. And what's interesting is two things are happening there. One is they hadn't thought about these things, so you're sharing them in a very non-threatening way. And two is we know that psychologically speaking, people literally hear stories like that differently than sort of a pitch. So people really do have a different reaction. And you'll actually see them, their eyes they'll be looking up like, oh, that's interesting. Wow, I hadn't thought about that. So you're sharing something in a very, very approachable way. And especially when you say things like, now, I don't know if you can relate to any of those. One of two things will happen. They'll be like, no, I think I can. How so? Tell me about that. And then you can get them doing more talking. Or they'll say this, well, not exactly, but how about this? And all of a sudden they come up with sort of other ideas that they might see in terms of how it benefits them. I think, Ken, you're really bringing up a key thought, which is, sure, some people will give out of the goodness of their heart, as it were, but almost all people will have some aspect of, this needs to be something that is mutually beneficial. There's a partnership, there's a strategic alliance. And I even like using words like that, right? This is, am I asking you for money? Well, if they were to ask that question, are you asking you for money? Well, possibly, but I don't know if that would work for you. We view it as an alliance, as a partnership that has mutual benefit. Otherwise, it probably doesn't last. Right. Because that's one of our key things is to make something that is not a one-time shot.
I agree. I mean, I think what you find right now in the philanthropic world is that, you get a lot of one-time shots and then you got to reinvent yourself every single year. And, one of the things about sales and customers and things like that is having that sustainability. And, a lot of times that's one of the biggest challenges that the nonprofit sector has is, look, I do a big, fundraising event and I bring on an honoree for that fundraising event and I get the money because they're supporting that honoree and the honoree did a good job of connecting to his, database of people. But then next year and the year after, they're gone. It was a 1 year shot. So it's like, how do you create that sustainability within?
Yeah. So to me, part of it goes back to the contract that you mentioned before, which is, are we laying out for them, not that we're asking them to commit for multi-years. That's not necessarily something that might turn people off, but to explain to them that many of our partnerships and alliances last many years. And the way that would typically work is we would work with them to lay out the criteria, keep track of what's working for them, keep track of how they're able to provide to our organization, but how it's benefiting them. And to use another sort of business term, some metrics that we can keep track of so that as we approach, say, the end of that year to say, how's it going? I know we had an intention or a hope that this would be something that would last for some time. Are we achieving that for you? Do you feel that it's benefiting you? So I think to have that constant conversation, not to take the one-time shot and then a year later say, by the way, do you want to take the one-time shot again? Yeah. So I think that's something you can build into as long as you build it in the context of, we don't know if it's going to last years, which sort of disarms them again. I think people will find that approach effective.
I find that, I know you bring up metrics, and I think that's a great idea. I think a lot of nonprofit organizations are not necessarily focused on the metrics. They're focused on the metrics internally. How much money did I raise? How did I do on the fundraising event this year versus last year? What sort of, contributions are coming from the board level, blah, 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 blah. But they're not looking at the metrics in terms of how did I benefit the person who donated the funds, and how do I continue to donate, and what sort of return did they get on their investment? I mean, you hear all the time these days about social return on investment. So what value did the donor get? And I think if you can kind of link value back to, and whether that's value they got through growth of their business or value they got through impact that you had, again, I think that comes down to what the goals were originally. Absolutely. That the donor had set in place.
Yeah. So two thoughts on that. One is we actually have a tool that we use with some clients, which we refer to it as a client satisfaction tool, which lays out, and this is what's interesting, is that everyone fills out with our help that tool at the beginning of a relationship that's unique to them. What are you looking for in this? So what are 3 or 4 measurable things we can keep track of? And they might be very different for company A versus company B. And then having an agreement that we're going to track those. We're going to talk, say, quarterly, or we're going to talk twice a year and say, how are we doing against these? So it gives us something that would be very specific to them that they're looking for. Some might be interested in getting the publicity. Some might be interested in getting their name out there. Other people might be interested in introductions to other boards that they might want to be on. So they might be very different metrics that are set up. The second thing that comes to mind is what you mentioned were all what we characterize as lagging indicators. How much money came in, where did it come from? I mentioned this before, but I think it's really important, is to come up with leading indicators, things that by doing certain things, we know it will lead to results. So for example, perhaps you'd set up an agreement with every board member that says, and I'm using this as an example, that once a month, your goal is to get me, the executive director, out to lunch with someone you know who you think could be involved with their organization. Well, that's a pretty trackable thing, right? If we keep reminding them of that and say, who are you going to get me out to lunch with this month? Now, it may sound like very specific and sort of onerous. We're not hiring them and firing them based on this, as we might with people in sales who have very, very hard metrics that they must meet in some cases. This is just a guideline, and they miss a month, you just remind them, I think we missed a month. Yeah. So those are leading indicators. And we think about that. If we knew that every one of our board members would invite someone out to a lunch or invite them to a meeting here or pick up the phone 4 times, whatever it might be. And we knew they did that with our help. And we said things like, would you like us to help hold you accountable to this? We know good things would come of it by definition, even if they're not very good at asking yet, which is a secondary area that that you can work on.
Okay. So I do like the whole aspect of what you do within your company in terms of measuring the returns that these individuals are getting. And I think that's something that a lot of nonprofits should be incorporating into what they're doing in terms of looking at almost like a little scorecard of how they've benefited the donors that they're working with, because I think that helps when they're going back and having those regular conversations with the donors to remind the donors what it is that you've done for them in terms of helping. Yeah,
and I think some of them can be hard and fast, sort of like real concrete type of things, but many of them could potentially be softer, quite literally. We really appreciate your organization being involved with us. We know many of your people now are on the team where you did that walk with us, whatever it might be. How are you feeling about it? How is the team feeling about it? And I think that's just as important. I think it's to talk about how people feel, the emotional aspect of what it does for them to be involved with these things is easily as important as anything else. Because if they're feeling good about it, they'll continue. And if they're bored about it or nobody's thinking about it, then at least we know, and then we can see if we can make some changes. Yeah, you just brought up another good point, organizational engagement. I think that's one of the things also that nonprofits need to do a better job of. If someone's going to be donating money to your organization, a business, how do you engage the whole business? How do you get to a point where you incorporate their employees into some of your activities and stuff so that you get a whole organizational involvement? Because especially today with the millennials, they really want to work for a company that's socially responsible. They want to get kind of involved, and they don't necessarily have the money to give, but they want to get involved. They want to feel like they're making a difference. Right. It reminds me of many products and services that might be unique to someone. So I have a brand new product and service. So the good news is I'm not competing with a lot of people. The bad news is people don't know how to buy my product and service. The assumption that they know how to engage with your not-for-profit, they know how to do what you just mentioned, those 5 different ways of engagement, is a big assumption. So I think that's part of our job, would be to educate them, obviously in the third-party story way, when we're just getting them involved. But once they're involved, to say to them, we would like to give you 10 examples of the ways that you can get your people involved. And most of them, I would imagine, would be based on what you've done with other organizations. So teaching them how to do that, I think, will go a very, very long way. And again, if they have their own ideas about how to do it, which might be rare, but exist, and those are even better. But they don't know how to do it. So we might need to teach them how to do that. So then from a leadership and training perspective, you're now talking about a trickle-down impact, because you're talking about leadership and training with your board members and your staff who you're trying to educate so that they do a better job of making the contacts and bringing other people into the fold of the organization. And now you're talking about that same leadership skills to the donors, to teach them how to maximize the benefit of the relationship with your organization. Right, and I also see that who's going to handle that can differ organization by organization, donor by donor. Like, do you have someone, for example, in your human resources department who could take the lead in this if you're a company that's large enough, or does the not-for-profit play a greater role in that? But I think that what you're hitting on there, Ken, is something that's so important, which is the differentiation between one not-for-profit and another. And we know that many of these people are being asked by many people for money or for help. And obviously part of the differentiation is going to come from what your not-for-profit is about and the passion that person might have around it. But I would submit to you that the way the not-for-profit approaches that person and the way they lay out what we just talked about can be a huge differentiator.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree tremendously.
I can give you sort of an example. I can imagine someone saying something like, so let me share with you how we work with our partners. We have a tendency to work very closely with them to create engagement with their staff. And I'll give you 3 examples of how we do that. Because what we find is the benefit to them is X, Y, Z, LMNOP. And that obviously then creates a better culture. So first we do A, then we do B, then we do C. We track that on a quarterly basis because we obviously are getting benefit from the donor, but we also need to have benefit for them. That's typically how we work with our partners. Any thoughts on that? And I suspect that some would be like, wow, I've never had a not-for-profit approach it this way or think about it this way or talk about it this way. That's different. And just, in other words, just your approach to dealing with them could be the differentiator that has them want to give to you versus someone else.
Especially since, the world has gotten a whole lot smaller and, used to give a lot more, people used to give a lot more locally, and that's not necessarily happening anymore. And there's, everyone's competing for the same dollar, especially with government shrinkage in terms of the funding that's coming from government sources.
Yeah.
So you really need to be able to differentiate yourself from everyone else to kind of rise above the clutter of social media and everything else that's out there.
Yeah. So I 2 thoughts about that again. One is that I think what we're reiterating is that we think that the differentiation is going to come exclusively from what it is that we have. Just as in, if I was selling insurance, I would try to tell people my insurance company is better. It won't work very well because everyone's heard that before. The differentiation can come in the way we approach people, and I think that's key. The second thought is this, though, is I'd be careful, to your listeners here, to think that there's only so much money and somebody's already giving to someone else. And the analogy I like to use is this. So I do sales training. I know other people who do public speaking training. I know other people who are consultants who work on helping the executive in some areas. And people will think, well, that people are not going to spend money on all 3 of these things because they sort of are similar and they overlap. And I just find that that's not true. That companies that are into growth might invest in 4 different things. And I think similarly, don't assume that just because they're giving to one that they can't give to you. They can't give to another. Their first reaction might be, I already give. And our response might be, I certainly appreciate that. I don't know if what we do would be a fit for you. Would you mind talking about it? And we'll see where it goes. But don't be surprised if givers give to more. Or they might be looking for something that is different in terms of their engagement with a not-for-profit. Or it might be that one of the not-for-profits that they're involved with, they're not as excited about anymore. So don't give up too easily based on that. That's an easy, to use a sales term, objection that someone can give you, and don't believe it. There's, people will give to more than one for sure.
I think this comes back also to something you had said earlier about those metrics and stuff. If they're giving to multiple organizations, or in your case, they're working with multiple professionals to kind of help them through. So, in this case, they may be working with you for sales training, and a nonprofit might be working with you for sales training and helping with the ask. They might be working with a professional fundraiser and stuff. I think, the more that there are those metrics where you can go to a donor and show the donor the differentiating factors of your organization compared to the other organizations they're working with. I think that's really where that the ability to get them to get deeper and deeper into your organization and become a much more strategic partner within your organization comes into play.
And that last point you made, I think, is really key. Is that do they view you like this? Like we are together in this. Or do they view you like this, like I'm throwing you some money here and there? And I think our goal is to not, I mean, sure, some might start this way, and our job is to move them closer over time, so that they get like this. But how do we start out with them recognizing that this is a possibility, even if they're just starting small with us, but to focus on where I'll say something you might think would be counterintuitive, but I can imagine if I were in a not-for-profit sector, saying to someone, I know this is going to sound strange, but we're really not looking for donors. We're looking for partners. And let me explain what that means. Sure. Well, we take someone's money.
I don't think that's counterintuitive at all. I think that's kind of taking it to, where maybe the sector should be thinking.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, I mean, and, I know I shared with you the other day, one of the things that we've decided to do as a firm is we've decided to work with a nonprofit organization, Book Fairies, and do exactly this, to kind of create a strategic partnership with them where, we're able to provide them with support and utilize that relationship that we have to garner, more or increase social media surrounding it, to increase the involvement of our staff and to get our staff more kind of married to the firm,
right.
And hopefully to increase the level of sales that we do as a firm.
Right. And you also mentioned you plan to give thousands of books associated.
Yeah. So what it is the way it works is that Book Fairies helps to put books and used books in the hands of children and adults who don't have access to these books. So we've committed that for every hour of service that we have, for every billable hour that we have for a client, that we will pay the cost to put those books in the hands of the individuals. And what that does is it becomes a differentiating factor for us in the marketplace. So I can go out and I can say to, an organization who already has that social desire to do good,
right.
I can say to them, look, not only will we do great work for you, not only will we provide value to the relationship, and we're going to think differently from everyone else, but on top of that, over the course of this engagement, we expect to incur about 150 hours worth of billable time. That's 150 books now that children and adults will have that they wouldn't have had in the past.
Right.
So by working with us, we're not only helping you, but we're also helping, and you're helping to help us to help others.
A couple of quick thoughts on that. So it reminds me of the sock company, I think, where they give one pair of socks to someone else.
Tom's Shoes.
Yeah, right.
It's a shoe company.
Yeah. So to me, it creates a differentiator as a selling point of your products and services. But I didn't tell you this. Well, you just did it. You did it now and you did it before, which is when you told me that story, it was a great example of telling a story as an example of the way people can work. And when you told me that story and you just said it again, my reaction was, that is so cool. I need to find something like that to do for my firm. And so I just think it was a great example.
Book Fairies is interesting.
Yeah, so maybe it's Book Fairies or maybe it's something else. But to me, that was a really interesting experience I had. You didn't say, hey, you should get involved with Book Fairies. You told the story and I was like, that is so cool. For my firm, how can I get involved with something similar? I could see it differentiating me. I could see meeting our company. I could see it getting my team of people more involved. I could see it being something that would be good for the world. I mean, so like 10 things went off in my head, and it was because you told the story.
And the good part about it, and this is something that nonprofits have to think about in this, is how do I create a partnership? If this is the avenue that as a business that I'm going to take to work with a nonprofit, how does the nonprofit create an avenue where it's easy to visualize?
Yeah.
So if I say for every hour, I'm putting a book in the hands of a child, you can visualize that book going into the hands of a child and a child using it. If I said to you, hey, if you work with me, we're going to make a $1,000 donation to a nonprofit organization, it doesn't hold that same cachet. It's not as, visually appealing.
Yeah. And I think that goes to sort of how do you market the relationship in such a way that grabs people's attention, right? Like you can see the person putting on that extra pair of shoes, right? You can see the person reading the book. So I think that's
But I think this is what you're talking about in terms of, when you were referring before, where it's not just I'm going and asking for a donation. I mean, the organization is getting probably more money out of us than they would have gotten if they would just come to us and ask us for a donation. And we see it as, we're getting tremendous benefit out of this relationship also because, we're getting and we've set up a little contract with them.
Yeah.
And in the contract, there's certain social media things that they're required to do, and they're required to help
Right.
us get our staff more engaged and everything else. So it really is a partnership. It really is not just, hey, I'm going out there and asking for a donation. It's I'm developing a strategic relationship
with that. And I think there's a key word there, which is leverage. You're leveraging something that can really expand in numerous ways. And I want to take that thought in a slightly different direction, which is, I think we often think that when we're asking for something, it's a one-to-one relationship. So let's take my world for a minute. I have clients in many different industries, and someone might say, can you refer me to someone for something? And sometimes I can refer someone directly to them. They are a cybersecurity firm, and I can connect them to someone who might need cybersecurity. But often I can connect them to someone who I know knows a whole bunch of people in the IT realm who can refer them to 10 people. So I think that's another thing to consider is, if I am asking, am I asking for that person to give me something? Perhaps, but am I also asking potentially to have that person connect me to other people who might be like-minded? And I think that can really create some leverage, where that it's perhaps even better to have that one person who I know knows 10 people like them, or 10 people connected in a certain way. And it's easy for them to connect me to. It might be easier for that one person to connect me to 10 people than it would for that first individual to give me money. It might be, just based on circumstances. I'd be happy to introduce you to these 10 friends of mine. Is no big deal. But for me to reach into my pocket and give you $10,000 might be difficult. So think of the leverage aspect of how can you take one activity that then can stretch further in terms of what you might get from it.
And I think this also goes back to understanding what the donor is looking for in the relationship. A donor, may be a business owner, and that donor may have maybe looking for a way to increase their business or their sales. Donor may be an individual who has no business. But they're looking to make a deeper impact overall to something they're passionate about. So again, I think it also comes back to, how do you measure impact?
Yeah.
How do you look at things from both a micro and a macro perspective? From a micro perspective, how am I changing the lives of the people that I work with, or
Yeah.
if it's not people, it's art or whatever, it's how I'm making a micro. And then from a macro perspective, what impact does that have on the overall environment or the overall economy?
Yeah.
I was talking to an organization this morning. It's an organization that works with the mental health population, and they do training. So they actually employ. They set up a little business that their individuals they work within, and they teach them how to function within that business world. And when they graduate from the program, they go out and they work in a retail or whatever environment that's out there, and their success rate is somewhere around 50%. So 50% of the individuals who start the program wind up in a work environment. So when you look at that from a leverage perspective, you look at that from an impact perspective, you can talk about the fact that I've got a 50% result. What does that mean? But also now you can look at it and say, well, these are 20 individuals that would have needed services and would have cost taxpayers money. And now these are 20 individuals who are out there earning an income, paying taxes. Think about that delta that happened there.
Right.
And if that's what really gets people excited, again, I think it comes back to having that conversation.
Yeah.
Where, no two, and one of the questions I was going to ask you is, and I think I just got the answer, but one of the questions I was going to ask is, what is the ask, or how do you know what the right ask is? But I guess the answer is no two asks are actually the same, and it's it takes some exploration.
Right, and I think that one of the things you're obviously very good at is sharing these examples and stories, and I think that's something that everyone can learn to do. I think one of the questions in general that we can be asking people, and they might or might not have a good answer, so we have to be prepared for that, and I'll share with you what I mean in a moment, but how do you think about, this is the question, how do you think about philanthropy and giving? How do you think about it? And they might have a good answer. Well, I do it for this reason, and this is what I like, and this is what I want, this is what I want to get out of it. Other people might be like, I don't know what you mean. And then you can say things like, well, let me give you 4 examples of different ways that people think about philanthropy. One is it's out of the goodness of their heart. 2 is that they see that it can have this ripple effect and tell a story like you told. 3 is that it can get engagement with their people into something. Now, back to you, Bill. Bob, whoever you are,
It was
Mary.
Bob, Bob.
It was
You've been
Bob,
talking
right?
about.
Can you relate to any of those? So what you're doing is you are teaching them things that they might not have thought of in terms of how they can rethink about it and how it can be their idea. Notice I'm feeding them the ideas, but as soon as they grab one, it's their idea. Well, I could see that working like this for us. And I would say, really, great idea. Exactly. How so? How do you see a variation of that theme? How would you make it yours? And, people love their own ideas and they might or might not love ours. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we see is that in the nonprofit world, development people try to put round pegs in square holes, square pegs in round holes,
right.
whichever one.
Either way, it won't fit, right? Yeah.
So they're constantly trying to put the wrong peg into the wrong hole.
Yeah.
So I've got something I'm trying to sell. I'm trying to sell, a sponsorship, or I'm trying to sell whatever. And I don't know about you, but I don't know that that's necessarily the right answer. I don't think there is something I should be trying to sell. I think I should be trying to understand what it is somebody wants to buy.
100%. And this is true of every product service sale. This is true of every not-for-profit, is the issue of, if I believe it's my job to convince someone of something, I am putting pressure on myself and I'm putting pressure on them. Rather, it's our job to have conversations with people. And I mean this quite literally. If I'm sitting in front of, I would imagine that some of your listeners and viewers would think that if I have a big donor in front of me, I know that guy or gal has tons of money, or that company has given a lot, then I'm going to feel more pressure than if it's somebody who might not. And just recognize we're creating a problem for ourselves right there, because we're feeling pressure and might put pressure on people. Rather, we'd suggest that you go have conversations with people with no expectations. Have conversations in terms of how they think about these things. See if you can discover together that there's a good fit. If there is, great. If there isn't, no problem. We shake hands and part friends. Perhaps they can introduce us to someone else. That if we have no expectations, and quite literally, I think you'll probably find this is true. You might have somebody who's a donor who in retrospect you wish you never had as a donor, right? So that's a good way to look at someone and say, do we really want
like that?
do we really want that relationship? So quite literally, if we can say, all we want to do is have conversations with people. The only thing I can control is reaching out, talking to people, having conversations. Sometimes there's a fit, sometimes there isn't a fit. And we can literally say that to people when we talk to them. Sometimes there's a fit, sometimes there isn't a fit. If there is, great. If there's not, there's not. No big deal. It just takes all the pressure off, and all of a sudden our ratio of people being interested in giving to us goes up, because we're not putting that pressure on people. If I called someone out of the blue and said, hey, look, we're a great not-for-profit. I'd like, typically people give $10,000 in a sponsorship. They're going to be like, thanks, but no thanks. I mean, just that quick. And I would too, you would too. We have no idea whether this would be a fit for them. We're just making this assumption and this push, versus we're involved with this not-for-profit. We happen to be in this particular arena. I don't know if it would be something of interest to you or not. Immediately disarms them. If you're open to a 5-minute conversation, we can see where it goes. People are dramatically more likely to say, I'll talk to you. And then you can see if you can get the conversation going, which really goes to people's mindset in terms of how much pressure they put on themselves. It's so much of this is being brave. Courage is not a word we often think of in terms of business, but I could easily say, oh, just call people. Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
But they're uncomfortable. So our perspective is, no, be afraid, learn ways of asking people, and then you'll find that when you do, it doesn't kill you. So you'll get over the fear. Don't wait until you're not afraid to try some things. But a lot of it relates to being courageous enough to try something new.
How do you know what the right ask is? I mean, you mentioned before that you got this big fish sitting in front of you. It's a whale.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know what to ask, or do you let them kind of feed you that?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. Of course, to ask them, as we mentioned before, how do you think about philanthropy and giving and so on, and they may have good answers. If not, we can certainly share some ideas with them. The point is that with that donor, you might share different ideas based on your experience with big donors than you might with someone who's a smaller, potential donor. So when you feed them ideas, you would potentially modify that based on, the story that would be more appropriate for them. For example, let's assume they have 3 people in their company. Well, you're not going to tell the story about, engagement with all of your employees. They just wouldn't be relevant. So figuring out what the messaging would be of those examples that would potentially relate to person A versus person B before you go into that meeting.
How do you determine that though? How do you do the research to really understand what it is that, or how to deliver the messaging?
Yeah. So I'll give you a quick example. I think people tend to think they have to have all the answers, to overcomplicate this. So quick example, my world, sales and business development training. If I'm talking to an organization or a business owner or a VP of sales that have 10 salespeople, I will talk about things like how people often struggle with having a high enough closing ratio. They do a lot of proposals for people, but they don't close nearly as many opportunities as they'd like, or their people don't have a deep enough pipeline of opportunities. Those are very sales specific languaging. On the other hand, if I'm talking to a professional firm, I will say things like, we find that the managing partners of firms are looking for their managers and partners to become rainmakers, but they know that they're not all that comfortable in rainmaking. And in fact, the training that often happens sounds something like this. Hey, see that guy Joe over there? He's a really good rainmaker. Try to be more like Joe. But they understand that Joe has these non-transferable skills. Joe doesn't even know why he's good. Now, I was just using those as examples where my message to a professional firm in terms of how they think about business versus my message to a sales organization in terms of how they think about business are going to be different. They're based on the same underlying assumptions. So I think one of the things that not-for-profits can do is to segment their donors, large organizations, small organizations, universities, whatever it might be, and say, what are the 3 messages that would be most appropriate to them? And now I take my cheat sheet. I know I'm going out to that particular university or that particular scenario, and I will be prepared with a slightly different message. And to your board members, for example, you can say, here's a document. If you're talking to these types of people, here are 3 key messages. You're talking to these types of people, here are 3 other messages. Some of them might be different. Some of them might be the same. We're not trying to get the exact answer. We're just trying to be directional so that person can relate to it.
So going back though, from the beginning part of this conversation, I'm not necessarily going to send out a board member with that cheat sheet to go. I'm going to go with the board member and make sure that the board member feels comfortable with the process.
Yeah, and it could be that I role play with the board member to see if they're comfortable without me, or I go out a few times and then say, are you more comfortable with this? But I think you're hitting a key nail on the head, which is having the expectation that the board knows how to do this is probably a bad assumption many times, and so it's our job to help them do that.
From a sales training perspective, I know that part of the reason you're here, and you said that you work with nonprofit organizations. What do you do with nonprofit organizations? How do you help nonprofit organizations get to a point where they feel more comfortable, or their boards feel more comfortable in this process?
Yeah. So there's 2 predominant ways we work with organizations, whether they're not-for-profit or for-profit organizations. One is that we have ongoing training classes that people can attend. And as I think you and I were talking about, 80% of that is the same, regardless of what it is we're selling. And the 20% that's different, it's our job to work one-on-one with them to create different messaging. So we have programs that people can attend where they're with other professionals and other business developers and other salespeople. What's interesting about that is there's a lot of networking that goes on. My greatest example of that is I had 2 printers in the room and one bought the other printing company. So you never know what can happen from a networking perspective. There's a lot of business that goes on within that. In some larger organizations and circumstances, they want something more customized, maybe just simply because logistically it doesn't make sense for them to join us. But here's one of our really strong beliefs. There's actually a book that was written by David Sandler, who founded Sandler Training many years ago. And the book is entitled, You Can't Teach a Kid to Ride a Bike at a Seminar. Now, the implication is if you're not doing ongoing reinforcement, take the bicycle. I can't stand in front of on the stage and show people how to ride a bike. You got to get on the bike. You got to fall off. You got to get on the bike again and fall off again until you eventually master it. So I think one thing which is true in many organizations, and certainly not-for-profits, is they think they can attend one seminar and anything's going to change, and it won't. We're trying to change people's behaviors, the way they think, the way they speak. And so generally when we work with clients, regardless of what type of clients, there's months of work to be done. So it's more extensive, sometimes more expensive, which is, to be honest, sometimes a challenge. Not-for-profits will will think I don't have the money for this, which is certainly understandable. But to be perfectly frank, I've tried to give it away to not-for-profits that I believed in, and they've rarely taken me up on it because even it's a charity to them. Because when there's no money exchanging hands, there's no value in their mind. So certainly, we're more than happy to find ways to make it easier for not-for-profits, but they're in the selling business, whether they like it or not.
Again, that's the part I don't understand. I mean, businesses spend so much money in training their sales force, yet nonprofits really don't invest in training their boards or training.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges there, and it's understandable, is they don't necessarily recognize, and we believe strongly in this, is there has to be a clear return on investment. If they don't see a clear, so it's all about investing. If someone's going to invest their money in you, what are the expectations they're going to have? The same thing would apply to your work in accounting and our work, which is, what does this do for me? And I think that getting people's mindsets over time to recognize that, okay, I'm going to spend time, energy, and money, and I'm going to double my donations over the next year. I just made that up. But if they believe that, would they not find the time, energy, and money? And interestingly enough, the time and energy and willingness to change is often a bigger issue than the money.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you also have in the nonprofit sector is the board changes on a regular basis. So, if you're investing in a board member, how long is that investment going to last?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that it would be more likely in our world that we would be working with employees of development people, heads of the organization, and then potentially do a couple of, we won't necessarily expect every board member to get to the same level as the executive director, but can you give them 2 or 3 shots of things that will just get them started, allow them to get that cup of coffee with people, and then invite the executive director in. So I think it's fair that you can't expect someone to invest the same level of time and energy in every board member if it's likely to change over time. But what can you give them that will make them more effective, more likely to stay because they feel like they're contributing, and create that sort of positive spiral?
And more comfortable in the process.
Here.
Yeah, so we are running low on time. So one thing I would like to ask is if you can maybe just throw out 3 or 4 takeaways that people who are listening to this should really kind of get from this, or things that you feel strongly about.
Sure. Number one is recognize what I would characterize as an attitude issue, a mindset issue, that if you're uncomfortable asking, or your people are uncomfortable asking, that is completely natural. And so working on that mindset, being willing to be brave and going outside their comfort zone is something that we have to help encourage people. Don't feel bad about the fact that you're nervous about it or scared about it. Tied to that is, do you know how to ask? And I think that that's what we would characterize as the tactics or techniques. So very often we can teach people a way to ask that makes them more comfortable, and they go, oh, I could try that. And then they're able to do it. So those two are very closely tied. The third piece is that behavioral piece. So we call this the BAT, behavior, attitude, and technique, the success triangle, is, do you have a set of things that you plan to do on a regular, consistent basis? And do you have a process for holding people accountable without being onerous or micromanaging them? And all 3 of those need to be in place. Doing the behavior, picking up the phone, asking the people to lunch, whatever, having the mindset and the attitude and the courage to do it, and then knowing how to ask. So working in all 3 of those areas is really effective. And there's really lots of books out there about these things that I would just recommend. As Sandler himself used to say, go to the self-help store in the self-help section of the bookstore. There's all kinds of great books about things like this.
Yeah, I think the other part that we discussed today also is the customizable. Try to make it customizable. One size doesn't fit all. Try to come up with a plan or a strategic alliance or partnership or collaboration, whatever you want to call it, that you can work with to really understand what it is that the individual or the company is trying to get out of this, so that when you do develop a plan and develop an ask, that plan or ask is going to be consistent with what their needs are.
They don't take it personally. They don't care about you or your not-for-profit. I mean, don't take that literally. Of course, sometimes they do, but they ultimately care about themselves, and we have to really tap into that and help them, not convince them, but help them discover why being involved with you would be something that would overall really be a huge benefit to them.
So, Rich, if someone wanted to get in touch with you and get more information, how can they do that?
Sure. I'll share with you my phone number and my email and my website, if you don't mind. So our local website here on Long Island is www.untitled rich.legend.sandler.com. And my email is rich.isaac@sandler.com, ISAAC, rich.isaac@sandler.com. You'd be surprised how often that five-letter word, ISAAC, is misspelled. They want to double something, but they never want to double the
Yeah.
And our phone number here on Long Island is 631-231-3538.
Thank you very much, Rich.
My pleasure.
So our next meeting of the Cerini Nonprofits here Connection will be Thursday, February 14th from 12 to 1. We'll be speaking to Ed Probst and Tommy DeMisa from Vanguard Insurance about attracting and retaining key employees. Thank you for participating today.